Hey, thanks for joining me here at EMP Cycle Works. Today we're putting the Maxell M892X cam in the 143 that we built a couple months ago. Try to get more power out of it. This thing made 171 horsepower and 158 foot-pounds of torque. And not disappointed, but feel like this engine should be able to produce more power than that. So we're going to try this cam. With the same Chromeworks 2-in-1 exhaust. Now this exhaust, I've made a lot of power on 131s. I make over, I've made 160 horsepower with this exhaust. So with this combination, I think 180 is kind of like the goal. So we're going to try the Maxell M892X cam first and see what that does. And then, if we have to change the exhaust, try to change the exhaust. I have a fuel moto pipe that I can throw on here just to test. So let's make some power. So this is the STFU Air Cleaner that works with the Scream Eagle ventilator here. It comes with spacers to fit this big air cleaner on here, and if you can see this right here, it starts to bend it if you tighten down with what they came with. So I have a little fix to minimize this, and I'll show you how I do that. So let's take it apart. We're going to take these little screws off the front of the cover to gain access to the actual mounting bolts here. And the STFU Air Cleaner comes with Phillips head screws here. And I have these Loctited in because I don't want this thing to come apart. So remove the filter, and you can see we have these studs. And I added an extra little nut in there with red Loctite so that I'll get a little bit extra length to this standoff here, and that will prevent the collapsing of the air cleaner that I showed you here. Nobody wants that. Okay, I got it prepped for the cam swap. Got the exhaust off. I got the left side spark plugs out, and I have it shifted over into 6th gear so I can spin the motor. I'm going to work on getting these pushrod tubes out first, and then we're going to tackle the cam chest. This bike is equipped with S&S pushrod tubes, so we're going to push down on the collar and use a small screwdriver in the gap to pop the cover off. And then pry the pushrod tubes up to expose the pushrods. Now we want to spin the motor over until we see the intake pushrod move up and then back down. And then that's going to be our base circle where we can remove the pushrods. And you can see it more clearly here. It goes up and then back down. These are quickie pushrods. So the first thing we need to do is loosen up the lock nuts, making sure we're putting pressure the correct way, like I didn't do there. Once that's done, then we can loosen up the inner pushrod tube, collapse it all the way, and remove the pushrod and pushrod tube as an assembly. Like so. Then we repeat the process for the remaining pushrods. Next we're going to work on getting the lifter covers and the lifters out of the bike. Break the bolts loose with an Allen wrench and then remove them with a ball Allen. Remove the bolt for the lifter cuff. This one has S&S. Remove the lifter cuff and pull the push rods out. And we want to make sure we inspect them. This engine doesn't have a lot of miles, but we want to make sure we have everything's good. There's no issues that we can see here. And I usually mark which lifter goes in which bore, but this is getting a new cam, so we're going to put new lifters in it. So that's not necessary here. Break loose our cam cover bolts. Once they're broken loose, I zip them out with my gun. I don't usually start with the gun because I don't want to strip out the bolts. And there's our S&S timing. And just inspect for any type of metal or anything. This kind of job will give you a good indication of how well the motor is running, so take your time. Remove the tensioner, and holding the rear brake, I can break the bolts loose for the cam and the pinion. I have a tool that I'll use later, but with the chain on, we can use the crank, the rear brake to lock up the motor. Zip off the timing. And then again, break the bolts loose with a ratchet before we use our zip gun and get these bolts out quickly. Remove the cam plate. Again, inspecting for any wear. This one doesn't have much wear at all. Inspect the cam. Not a lot of wear on that, which is great. And that's a CR545 cam we got from Cyclorama. Pull out the oil pump, and again, inspect the oil pump. This is a cam replacement kit I got from Fueling. Comes with everything you need to do this job. So we're gonna, just like always, replace the cam bearing with a new cam. Some people don't do this, but I think it's cheap insurance. Anytime you replace the cam, just to replace the bearing, or anytime you're in there, replace this bearing. I use a special tool to remove and install the bearing, just to avoid any kind of damage. When we install this bearing, we install it with the writing facing the tool. The bearing race is reinforced with on the side with the writing on it, so it can accept the pressure of this. And then just carefully press the bearing in until it stops. With the right tool, the depth will be set, and also the bearing will go in squarely to the engine case. And you can see I put a rag on the pinion just to protect it there. Next step is our O-rings. Get the cam plate O-ring in, and then the oil pump O-ring. And then reinstall our cleaned and inspected oil pump. And I'm going to use a generous amount of oil on this just to speed up the time it takes to prime the whole system. S&S pumps push out a lot of oil, so it should be quick, but this just aids the process. Then we're going to install the inner part of the oil pump, making sure the seal is on the back of it, and the inner gear has a step in it, and then that step is going to face the pinion shaft because it's clearance for the pinion, so the oil pump can go in the correct way. A little bit more oil on our separator plate. Then we're going to install our locating dowels, the separator plate, oil up the outer oil pump body, installing the middle gear. Then the outer body goes on with a little bit more oil, and then finally we're going to install the outer gear set here. And you don't want to force these gears, they'll go in, you just got to spin them and make sure everything's right. And they're going easily. A little bit more oil. Here's our Maxell cam. We're going to use assembly lube on this because it's a brand new part, and assembly lube in the brand new bearing. And cam installs pretty easily. And I'm just visually checking to make sure I have clearance. Next step is oil up the cam plate and install it. Now you don't want to force anything, you just want to make sure that the cam and the cam plate are indexed properly onto the engine case. And spin everything, make sure it spins freely of the cam. Now I use blue Loctite on all these fasteners just to prevent anything from backing out. Fueling recommends using their ARP bolt lube on these because they're afraid of clearance being an issue if using too much Loctite. But if you use a small dab on each bolt, I don't think you're going to have a problem. So I run them in all pretty much by hand. Once I get the cam plate bolts snugged up by hand, I'll spin the motor just to make sure the pinion is centered in the cam plate. So right now I'm centering the pinion to the cam plate by spinning the motor, and again it's in 5th gear. Now I'll torque all the cam plate bolts to 120 inch-pounds in the respective order outlined by the instruction manuals for this cam plate. Once that's done, I'll spin the motor again just to make sure everything is free and I have no binding. And then the same process with the oil pump. So I'll tighten everything by hand with my little Allen wrench just to touching, not even really snug. Spin the motor
over again. This will center the oil pump to the pinion shaft. And then I'm going to torque everything to 60 inch-pounds for the first go around. Spin it again to make sure I don't have any binding. And then the final torque of 120 inch-pounds. And it will be complete. The installation of the oil pump will be complete. Now I'm going to put the spacer on the cam that was originally installed, and then install the pinion and the cam gears. And we need to check alignment here. So I'm going to lube up the bolts and torque them both to 25 foot-pounds. And here I'm centering or lining up the timing dots so I can put my little tool in the in between the gears to lock them in place. And so 25 foot-pounds. Remove the tool. Sometimes you have to shake the wheel back and forth to get it out of there. And then I'll use a straight edge and a feeler gauge to check the alignment here. And you want less than 9 thousandths because the shims that we replace come in 10 thousandths increments. So if it's less than 9 thousandths, you're good. But I try to get as close to 0 as possible. Now we're ready to do our timing for the final time. So install the timed pinion and cam gear. Time it by aligning the dots with the chain. Install them. And then we're going to install our lock again. Red Loctite on the threads, and I use the ARP bolt lube in between the head of the bolt and the washer. Now we torque everything to 25 foot-pounds, back it off one complete turn, and then the pinion gets 25 and the cam gear gets 35 foot-pounds final torque. Blue Loctite on the tensioner bolts, and we'll torque that to 120 inch-pounds. And then I'm going to add a generous amount of oil to the chain and the gears. That way nothing is dry when we first turn this on. And then I will spin the motor again just to make sure I'm not feeling any binding. And we appear to be good. Double check, make sure our timing dots line up. Now I need to check piston to valve clearance, and I'll do that by using a solid push rod that I made in a previous video. We need 60 thousandths of clearance here. One rotation of the push rod is 313 thousandths, so that means each flat is 52 thousandths. The other thing we have to keep in mind is our rocker arm ratio is 1.64 to 1. With that information, we can do some math and figure out that we need to turn 7 flats in order to get clearance. We're going to do 8 just so we have a little bit of clearance. And that will give us our 60 thousandths of piston to valve clearance. Once we got this 8 flats, we'll turn the motor over very gently here, because we don't want, if we do have clear contact, we don't want to damage anything. And it seems to be free, no contact. So our piston to valve clearance is at least the 60 thousandths that we're looking for. Word of caution, if you're going to do this, be very careful, double check all your math, and make sure you use a solid lifter. If you don't use a solid lifter, this is going to be an incorrect calculation and you could run into issues. Now to be triply sure, I'm going to redo the whole process again just to make sure that I'm correct. And we're good. No contact. Now we're using the new Jim's lifters. These things are great. They pump up really quickly, and they're very, very stable at high speeds. So, and they have the oil feed hole kind of at an angle there, as to force in more oil as it comes down into the lifter bore. Use my fueling tool to pre-bleed them, fill them up with oil, put them in with the oil holes facing each other. And then once all the lifters are installed, I will install the cam cover just to make sure no contamination gets in here. And I will use blue Loctite on the bolts and torque them to 120 inch-pounds. Now this has S&S lifter cuffs on it, and I'm going to use a feeler gauge in between the lifters to make sure these are centered as much as possible, lifter to lifter and lifter to guide or cuff, and that'll just ensure that there's no resistance when between the cuff and the lifter. And the lifter cuff bolt will get a final torque of 120 inch-pounds with some blue Loctite on the threads. Now spin the motor, and I'm looking for the lifters to go up and then down with no resistance. Here's a closer look at that. It's actually me hitting the starter button. What I'm trying to do here is pump the lifters up with oil. Once that happens, new gasket, and then the lifter blocks go on with blue Loctite, and we're going to torque these to 120 inch-pounds. Kind of a theme. Most any quarter 20 bolt on a Harley motor gets 120 inch-pounds of torque. And I'm going to remove the old pushrod O-rings. It's going to get all new O-rings in the top, the bottom, and the middle of the tubes. You probably can reuse these since this motor has such low mileage, but it's just not worth it for me. I don't want to have to come back and redo it. So I'm going to spin the motor over, and I want the intake pushrod to go up and then down. And once it goes down, then that is my top dead center compression for that cylinder, and I can install pushrod and pushrod tubes and adjust them at this point. The video I put the rear cylinder on top dead center, but I assure you that I did the same thing to the front when I adjusted it. Or before I adjusted it, I should say. And these push rods are going to get 4 complete turns from 0 lash, and that will give us our adjustment. So on these S&S push rods, I adjust the inner tube or the inner push rod and the 16 flats, and then I'll use my scissor method to tighten the bolt. Don't go too tight because those bolts are cast, I believe, and they will break the lock nuts. So once they're good and secured, we will install the retaining, and I'll clean my greasy fingerprints off of it as much as possible. Try to clean as I go. Enjoy that rumble. Nice. Ended up making 173 horsepower and about 173 foot-pounds of torque.